Hello, my name is Barry Hurd. Over the last few months, Chris, our cameraman, and I have been out and about capturing pictures of tractors at work. In this documentary, we'll be looking at the modern tractor, talking about the companies that make tractors and their history. We will also try and judge what the development in tractor manufacturing over the past 100 years has done for the farmer. No one can deny that this is not a romantic image conjured up from the past. For hundreds of years, teams of horses like this, urged on by skilled ploughmen, worked the fields in this country. But they could only plough, depending on the soil, between an acre to 1.5 acres per day. That's about 0.4 or 0.6 of a hectare per day. By comparison with an average tractor of 120 horsepower bought today, the average farmer could be expected to plough 2 or 3 acres in an hour. That's 0.8 to 1.2 hectares in an hour. It still remains to say it is a wonderful sight. Let's just stay here for a few seconds and watch these wonderful Shire horses, these great beasts. Steam was to be the first alternative on farms, beginning in the latter part of the 19th century, to replace horses, oxen and mules, and millions of people who spent their working lives doing repetitive, strenuous, dangerous work. And it seems strange to think now, as little as 200 years ago, half the population had to work on the land to supply the food necessary to keep the country fed. The animals too that provided the pulling power for the machinery used in those days also required a substantial amount of the food that they helped to provide for themselves. Today in this country only around 2 to 3% of the working population work in agriculture, providing enough food for the rest of us. This of course leaves free a far greater amount of us to provide the luxuries we have grown to expect in our ever-improving lifestyles. I think the accolade for producing the first self-propelled agricultural steam engine, or the ancestor to the traction engine, must go to the company Ransom's of Ipswich, and they displayed it at the Royal Show in 1842. Only 10 years later, there were at least 12 companies building them, and there was approximately 8,000 portables on UK farms. In the US too, a lot of interest was being shown for these portables, and of course over there the size of the country alone made it a far greater market than could ever be achieved here in the UK. I think it is time now to jump ahead a little, as this programme is about tractors and not traction engines, as important as they were in their time. And although the steam engine was first developed in England, the United States must take the credit for the evolution of the tractor. We wondered when we were trying to plan this documentary what the best way was to go about such a big subject as working tractors. We agreed, as we just couldn't go through the whole story of tractors, it's far too big, we would look at the companies that have produced them in the past and those that still produce them today. These of course are brand new John Deere machines, and comparing them to the tractors the same company made last century, well, you'd think you're on a different planet. A farmer today can sit in a comfortable air-conditioned cab with stereo and inboard computer that can take the strain out of any of the jobs that he has to tackle.
Then you work on the right side first, clear your chase and then all comes along. There we are, and that's what we've done.
Here you can see a John Deere tractor and plough. It was John Deere who started this company, who lived from 1804 to 1886. He developed the world's first commercially successful self-scouring steel plough. I've given a brief account of the life of John Deere and his accomplishments in another documentary about vintage tractors. So I'm going to jump forward now in the story of the John Deere company to when they began producing tractors. This began when the Deere and Company, under its third president William Butterworth, bought many companies, including in 1918 the Waterloo Gasoline Engine Co., and tractors became an important part of the John Deere line. And this is a 1915 Waterloo Boy Overtime Model R. It was the first successful gasoline tractor to be produced. So by John Deere buying the company that developed it, it gave them a good start with a new venture. This Waterloo Boy has a two-cylinder engine, and John Deere continued using two-cylinder engines until about 1960 when they went over to multiple cylinders. Another interesting thing about this type of Waterloo Boy tractor, about 3,000 of these tractors were used by us over here during the First World War. Obviously manpower was short in this country to produce food, as so many men were in the trenches on the Western Front, so that these were an absolute godsend and helped us with the production of agriculture and kept the country fed. This is a 1928 John Deere GP, or General Purpose Tractor. In fact, it was a second design following the Waterloo Boy. It was built in the same year as Charles Deere Wyman, one of John Deere's great-grandsons, took over direction of the company. It was also at this time when agriculture was taking giant steps towards modernisation. The company went through a period of rapid growth, and by the 1930s the company achieved $100 million turnover in gross sales for the first time in its history. Here's another John Deere tractor. It's a version of the model introduced in 1934. The wheels being placed together as they are on the front gives it a very small turning circle. These tractors are sometimes known as Johnny Poppers because of the sound their twin cylinders give them. During the years this tractor was produced, John Deere sales continued to increase, and after the Second World War the company found itself safely established amongst the nation's 100 largest manufacturing businesses. After the death of Charles Wyman in 1955, the helm, or should I say the wheel, was taken over by William A. Hewitt, who steered the company through an ever-expanding period of growth until 1982, when Robert A. Hanson succeeded Hewitt as chief executive. And once again record sales were reached in the last 3 years of that decade, and the story goes on until today as more record profits are achieved and the company continues to increase its position in the global market.
Finally, as we leave the ring,
Of course, today John Deere tractors still bear the name of the company's founder. Yet when he died in 1886, John Deere himself could never have seen a petrol-driven tractor. One last thing about John Deere the man. In 1962, at a dig in Illinois, archaeologists discovered the exact position of John Deere's blacksmith shop. It was where he developed the first successful steel plough in 1837, and with it he helped open the West. Here we have a Case 135, and the driver is about to display one of the many jobs modern tractors can so simply be adapted to undertake. Jerome Increase Case, who lived from 1819 to 1891, founded the J.I. Case Company in 1842. The company began to build steam engines for agriculture in 1869. The first, I think, can still be seen in the Smithsonian. It still had to be towed by horse and only used a belt for power, but it was the first of 36,000 various kinds of steam engine to be built over the years to come. As I continue with this brief history of the Case Company, I'm going to show you some pictures we have taken over the past of vintage Case tractors still in wonderful working order. During J.I. Case's time as president of the company, it manufactured more threshing machines and steam engines than any other company in history. One interesting point worth mentioning is that the famous eagle trademark used by the company was patented after a bald eagle called Old Abe. It was the mascot of Company C in the 8th Wisconsin Regiment that fought in the American Civil War. By 1886, Case was the largest worldwide manufacturer of steam engines, and by 1895, as ignition and carburation equipment is improved for gasoline tractors, Case ventured into selling several sizes of two-cylinder models. As the company entered the new century, it was still at full stretch producing farm steam engines and threshing machines. And it wasn't until 1913 work started on the building of the Case Tractor Works near Racine, Wisconsin. The tractor you're watching now is a 1915 Case model, and it's the 12-25. This is a Case row crop model. The first were produced in 1930. I'm not sure what year this one is, but I know it's a lot later than that. Notice the distinctive side steering arm, which had various nicknames such as the chicken perch. While you're looking at the features of this tractor, I'll continue with the story of Case Company. Owing to a huge drop in sales after the end of the First World War, in the early 20s a price war broke out between tractor manufacturers. Ford and International both cut their prices to try and maintain volume, and by 1923 Ford had 76% of the market, International had 9%, and the remaining 15% was shared between the other 73 manufacturing companies, which included Case. Throughout the depressed period between the two world wars, Case still managed to grow, and they were still able to purchase other companies, ever expanding their range of products. In 1939, just before the outbreak of war in Europe, red became the identifying colour of Case equipment, with the introduction of a new fleet of tractors, including the D series. The tractor you're looking at now is a 1924 Case 1832. This model was made up till 1928, and for a saving this tractor had an auxiliary fuel tank, so you started it up on petrol, then switched over to paraffin. This was a trick, I believe, adopted by many drivers of cars in this country during the Second World War. Here's a few statistics you might find interesting. In the USA in the 1920s, when this tractor was new, one farmer supplied less than 10 people. It wasn't until 1930, in fact, that this figure was just about reached. It still took 15 to 20 labour hours to produce 100 bushels of wheat. By 1940, things hadn't improved much. The number of people supplied then by one farmer only increased by 1 to 11. The explanation for this, the slow horse was still favoured by many farmers, and I guess labour was cheap during the Depression.
It was the most popular tractor since
The tractor you're looking at now is a 1926 Case 12-20 Crossmount. Before the war, Case had taken over a few other companies to increase its range of farm implements. But after the war, the Case story becomes quite complicated on the business side. So let's jump to the 50s and look at some of the interesting developments. By 1950, one farmer could then supply 15.5 people, half again more than 1940. In 1954 in the States, the number of tractors on farms at last exceeded the number of horses and mules for the first time. In 1954 too, it only took 6 to 12 labour hours to produce 100 bushels of wheat. 1957 saw Case buy out the American Tractor Corporation, and in 1958 the company's foreign operations are expanded as subsidiary companies are opened in Australia, Brazil and in England. Look at this huge prairie monster, built I believe in 1915. This is the two-cylinder 2040, of which as many as 4,000 were built. In the 1960s, the Case expansion continues, as in 1964 they buy the Colt Manufacturing Co. that produced 10 to 12 horsepower garden tractors. By 1965, Case are represented throughout the world by 125 distributorships, subsidiaries and licenses. By then, 20% of the US production was shipped overseas. Then in 1966 comes a bit of a shock. Controlling interest in Case is acquired by the Kern County Land Company of San Francisco, California, but future operations were secured by an extremely good refinancing plan. But then in 1967, straight away comes another surprise. Kern County Land Company is taken over itself by Tenneco Incorporated of Houston, Texas, the world's largest distributor of natural gas, with additional interests in oil, chemicals, packaging and related investments. I'm going to wind up the story of Case fairly quickly now. Tenneco carried on buying more and more companies all over the world, many of which were added to the many already under the Case name. By 1974, sales surpassed $1 billion, and in 1985, still wishing to increase its market position, Tenneco acquired the major assets of International, making Case the second largest farm equipment manufacturer in the industry, and Case became Case IH. More and more purchases follow, and then in 1999 CNH is created through the merger of Case and New Holland. Today the company is a recognised leader in the agricultural and construction industries. Such is the history of just one of the companies who produce today's working tractors with all their sophistication, and it all began in the early 1840s when Jerome Case established his business. I'd now like to talk about another influential tractor organisation. It was called International Harvester, and you're looking at one of their earlier models. This one was built in 1918 and it was called the Titan. International Harvester, the company Case took over in the 1980s, was formed in 1902 through the merger of 5 companies, the most important of which were the McCormack and Deering companies. This merger made International worth a massive 120 million, an enormous amount at that time. Of course, at the beginning, International Harvester's main business was not tractors. At the company's formation, it represented 90% of the grain binder business. Also at formation, 20% of its business lay overseas, and it remained its policy to continue with its overseas expansion. It also intended, by taking over more companies, to offer a complete line. In 1903, tillage equipment and more harvester production capacity was added, and in 1905, hay tools to add to existing mowers and rakes. These included the first side delivery rake and hay loader. Ironically, the first tractors International Harvester offered for sale was made by a separate company, but soon the Mogul and Titan ranges were in production and sold separately through the McCormack and Deering dealer networks. These tractors were both different, having their own design features. The Titan, introduced in 1913, weighed about 9.1 tonnes and cost $2,360. The Mogul version was available from 1911, and at $2,475 was slightly more expensive, but it was heavier and slightly faster. And following the win at a plough competition in France, exports to Europe soon followed. Owing to its desire to continually expand, plants were opened in other countries, including Sweden, Russia, Germany and France. Then came World War I. During this time, a huge demand for labour-saving tractors was followed by a slump and a price war. In the early 20s, Ford cut prices dramatically, followed by International Harvester, and they managed to retain 9% of the market. By 1923, many of the company's previous brands and distribution systems were consolidated, leaving only McCormack, Deering and International, and shortly afterwards the famous Farmall was introduced. Also in 1923, the 100,000th thresher was produced, but by then threshers were seeing their last days as production on the large grain combines began. 1924 saw the first Farmall tractor, and it was to revolutionise the industry. It was of light design and high power to weight ratio, narrow front with single guide wheel and precision steering for cultivation. But the main advance was the unified system of tractor and matching implements for ploughing, cultivation and harvesting. By 1930, production of the Farmall tractor had reached 100,000, and by 1974, International Harvester had produced its 5 millionth tractor, which was a Farmall 1066. All the tractors you've been looking at since I began the history of International have been International tractors. This one is a 1943 Farmall A. In 1937, as so many tractors were moving on the public roads, with safety uppermost in their minds, International painted all the Farmall tractors red, including their wheels, replacing their previous grey colour schemes. You're now looking at a 1944 International Standard W9. In 1939 saw the second generation of Farmall tractors, the Signature Letter Series. A and B stood for the small tractor, H the middle size, and M for the large size. This is an A. The new tractor's modern styling was thanks to Raymond Loewy, I hope I pronounced that right, who was an industrial designer brought in by International to give their tractors a modern family appearance. Note the radiator grille design, the 3 silver stripes, and the 3-dimensional Farmall nameplate. This is a 1930 International 1020. And this is a 1956 McCormack International Cub. An interesting thing about this tractor is that it was one of 60 made in France for work in the vineyards. For this it had a shortened axle on the right hand side, which allows the driver to sit behind the bonnet. In 1947 in the States, the Farmall Cub with the Farmall A's and B's was produced in the Louisville Works, which was called the largest tractor plant in the world. Here production capacity could reach as many as 2,200 per week. This 1936 International W30 was found by its present owner at a furniture auction in Stockport. He purchased it and restored it. In 1947 too, production of the Farmall tractor began in this country at a plant in Doncaster. Another big milestone for the Farmall was reached in 1951 when Farmall Works, the millionth Farmall, was produced. Number 76 there is a 1950 Farmall Cub. It's an 8 horsepower tractor that also worked in the vineyards in the south of France. And here's another Cub that spent its working life in France, this time in the Bordeaux region. This is the 1949 Cub. And that's the W30 again, with 1936 International that was found in the furniture auction. It's strange to think that something like that could be found in such a place, but it's in wonderful working order now, as all the tractors have been seen today. They're all in wonderful working order. In 1954, the new number series Farmalls are introduced, but I don't think there are any of those here today, or any of the latter models International Harvesters produced. So I shall wind up this brief history by saying International went on producing the International and Farmall tractors until 1985, when Tenneco, who had taken over Case a little earlier, took over International as well. And their products were produced under the Case badge, making it, as I said earlier, the second largest farm equipment manufacturer in the industry. In saying there's none of the later International models here today, I'm proved wrong immediately by seeing this 1966 International B450 roadless. I think this one spent its whole life as a winch tractor. And now we're back to where we started with another International Titan. This one's a 1919 model, and it's been wonderfully restored, as you can see, and still working beautifully, as you can hear. With what better sight and sound could we wind up the history of as great a company as International Harvester? This Massey Ferguson is another fine example of a working tractor, still with a job to do. Local fishermen, this is Clacton, still use it to take their boat down to the sea. For the last part of this programme, we're going to go back to the Dorset Steam Fair, where we are going to show you some of the more unusual of the tractors, still in marvellous working condition, that visited that great event this year. As they go past, I'll try and give you some information about some of these tractors. The tractor in front is a 1943 Fordson Standard M, but 14 is a 1951 David Brown Cropmaster. The current owner's father used to use this tractor for sawing and hauling firewood. And this is a 1957 Minneapolis Moline GBD. Minneapolis Moline did a market survey, I think it was in the 30s, when they asked farmers if they would like a cab on their tractors. The answer was a big yes, but because the cost of these tractors with this cab, with all the luxuries that went with it, was about twice the price of other tractors of the same horsepower, it was a failure. But yeah, it was about 40 odd years ahead of its time. Here's a John Deere we haven't looked at before. This is driven by a two-cylinder petrol engine, and if you can look at the back, you'll see it's fitted with a single furrow plough. Here's the David Brown again. This company, abandoned by Ferguson in 1938, was one of the first to see the importance of diesel, and it was optioned in this model, the Cropmaster, when it came out in 1949. And of course electric starting was standard. This 1947 Bristol 20 crawler was apparently found upside down in a scrapyard, and it looks in wonderful condition now. This is a rare tractor. This is the 1959 Fendt Fix from Germany. The Minneapolis Moline again. The Minneapolis Moline Power Implement Company was formed in 1929 with the joining of the Minneapolis Steel Machinery Company, the Minneapolis Threshing Machine Company, and the Moline Implement Company. MN continued to make tractors under this name until 1963, when the White Motor Company took control of it. And this is a 1952 Chamberlain Super 70DA. This was imported 5 years ago, but it was built in Welshpool, Western Australia. It's 52 horsepower. This Bristol tractor was made when the company was owned by Saunders. Bristol's changed hands several times. This tractor has an Austin car engine and roadless tracks.
Another market garden tractor tractor. This one was a 1950 EMB President 8 horsepower, owned by Mr. J. Webb from Kingston, Southeast. The C model was manufactured from 1955.
Minneapolis Moline tractors, as well as many others, were shipped over to the UK during the war on Lend-Lease. This was that Britain promised to pay the American companies back after the war was over. Here's another MM tractor. This is the 1947 UDS. This is the German 1959 Fendt Fix again. It's 16 horsepower, a rare tractor imported from Germany. It's a single cylinder diesel and a hydraulic 2-furrow plough attached to the back. You just briefly saw a Ruston, but here we have another German tractor. This time it's the Porsche. Here's the 20 horsepower 1922 Ruston again. I believe this tractor was modelled on the Fordson F. It's owned by the Williams Heritage Museum at Silman's Yat near Hereford.
The tractor is fitted with a Deere 3-cylinder diesel tractor pulling a proper drag up on the field. What a beautiful sounding tractor they are on the road. This one is built in Welshpool, Western Australia, and is employed there.
This Porsche Junior was built in 1963. It has a 15 horsepower air-cooled diesel engine with 6 forward gears and 2 reverse. It was sold new for £565. I think that's the Massey Harris Pony 2. It was built in 1947. It was 15 horsepower. It was the smallest tractor Massey Harris built. Here's the John Deere L, built in 1946. 11 horsepower this one. A 2-cylinder petrol engine fitted with a John Deere single furrow plough. Well, here's a rare tractor now. This was a tractor built to replace the Grey Ferguson, but it didn't prove to be very successful. There's not many of them about now. This is the 1966 BMC. Looking at the programme, this tractor worked on a small holding in Cheshire. Not really great else I can say about it. It's 18 horsepower. Let's have a look at it, because as I say, there's not many of these about. This is a 1948 OTA 10 horsepower three-wheeler. OTA stood for Oak Tree Appliances, and the company was based near Coventry, England. This tractor was built with a Ford engine and a 3-speed gearbox. The front wheel was steered by cables. The first of these OTAs was built in 1949, and it made its first public appearance at the 1949 Smithfield Show. OTA's tractors were not popular and sales were poor, so I think it's rather strange that a company like Singer eventually took them over in 1953. The new owner did very little to change the tractors OTA produced. They changed the name, they changed the colour, and they changed the rear linkage, but that was about it. Production stopped, I think it was in 1956, when Singer itself was taken over. And there's a Field Marshal, a fine example of one of Britain's first commercially successful diesel tractors. This is another of the tractors here today that was built in Germany. It's the 1958 Hatz TL. It has a 12 horsepower single-cylinder air-cooled diesel engine. Hatz was formed in 1880, I believe, and still makes small engines today. This is a second tractor here today that we've seen, made by David Brown. This 1948 model has a 35 horsepower engine. This tractor, I believe, was used on a large estate near Oakhampton for timber work. And when it was retired in 1986, I believe it was just left out in the woods until 1994, when the current owner rescued it and restored it back to its current state today. Here's a beautifully restored 1950 Massey Harris. This one's much bigger than the last one we saw a little while ago. This one's fitted with a Perkins P6 engine. I believe it was bought a couple of years ago as a total wreck, and look at it now. Now we see the green and yellow of Oliver. This is the 1951 Oliver 77 Standard, 34 horsepower diesel. I was told that it was purchased from Canada about 8 years ago, and it was restored by its owner. Here's a nice one to look at. This is the 1955 Fordson EIA County Crawler. I believe this one came from Kent, it worked in Kent. You just saw Nuffield go past. That was the government after the Second World War asked Lord Nuffield if he could produce cheap tractors for use in this country and export, but I think the shortages of just about everything delayed their launch. And this is another Field Marshal. Their slow revving single cylinder engine certainly gives them a distinctive exhaust note. Well, that's about it. I hope we have selected some interesting tractors for you to look at, but I think you must agree all of them have been beautifully restored back to their original working order. Some of them, in fact, look as if they've just come out of the factory door. So as we watch these final few tractors finish off their display, I'll say goodbye to you from the Dorset Steam Fair.